So, once again, a seemingly inconsequential diocese in the southern United States has found itself the center of attention and something of a lightning rod for more universal conflicts within the church, as their relatively new bishop has implemented the strictest crackdown of the traditional Latin Mass imaginable. Bishop Michael Martin of Charlotte, North Carolina also made headlines for a number of other changes he has either made or indicated will be made at a rate of speed that has apparently alienated significant portions of his diocese. And I'm not a journalist, so I'm not going to rehearse all the details of those stories, but if you are interested into going into that detail, I'd go check out The Pillar, who has been covering those affairs in a measured and balanced way. But what I do find interesting is the, some would say, predictable debates, especially online, which always re-emerge whenever shots are fired in the church's so-called liturgy wars. And one particular point I wanted to take issue with today, because these measures of cracking down on the TLM are always framed by those in favor of them as merely addressing liturgical preferences, and as such, not really worth fighting over. I saw several people say something to the effect of, the excessively negative reaction to this bishop's decision only proves that people are too attached to their preferred liturgy, or something like, attachment to liturgical style shouldn't come at the expense of church unity. Now, I would say the first and most obvious rejoinder to this kind of a statement or sentiment is that it's easy to say things like this when it isn't your liturgical preferences being restricted. Even when slight changes were made to the English translation of the Novus Ordo, like shortly after I became Catholic some 15 years or so ago, I remember there being quite a lot of disruption and complaining over just those small adjustments that were made to the Novus Ordo. Now imagine if something like what happened in the 60s to the Latin Rite was done to Byzantine Catholics who used the Divine Liturgy. Imagine if some committee rewrote their liturgy in order to accommodate modern concerns, and then when inevitably Eastern Catholics took exception to this change, all the Latin Rite Catholics just said, you shouldn't be so attached to one particular form of the liturgy. How callous would you have to be to reduce such concerns to an accusation of private interest and preference? For my part, I would see that as painfully dismissive of legitimate concerns of the loss of an ancient form of the liturgy which gave structure and meaning to the source and summit of the faith for countless Catholics. When people make these kinds of dismissive statements, it seems to suggest that they think that liturgical form is something akin to personal preferences like blondes or brunettes, and that such things are both trivial and unconditionally pliable to the point where any adherence to a particular form is seen as the assertion of something that should be merely private and personal. It's actually kind of amazingly reminiscent of the way that secularists and atheists treat religious sensibilities and morals in public debates when they say that such opinions should be kept private, as all religious persuasions should be, disregarding that religion is, by definition, publicly adhered to. In reality, these are forms of prayer and worship which have slowly and organically developed over the course of centuries. When we say these words and perform these gestures, we join our words and gestures with countless generations of saints who came before us and continue on in that heavenly liturgy. They are that cloud of witnesses described in the book of Hebrews. Surely that isn't something to just balk at and treat with a kind of indifference we do towards other personal preferences. But the thing I find so surprising about that same indifference is we aren't just talking about people not being able to access a liturgical form that they prefer, like some now obsolete form of technology like VHS videotapes. These aren't just individuals and their preferences that are affected, but entire communities who were brought together by the practice of those liturgical forms. Imagine if tomorrow the current ordinary form of the Latin liturgy was just outlawed and all the parishes that perform it were subsequently shut down. Obviously that wouldn't happen, but if it did, it would mean a lot more than the mere loss of liturgical form. It would mean the loss of all those communities and the people that take their affiliation within those communities for granted. My family and I attend the TLM. It's the only one available in our archdiocese. It's a community that has probably more than, I would say, tripled in size since we started attending it just a few years back. The community that has galvanized there represents everything I could ask for in a community, for myself and for my children, in terms of spiritual and moral edification, as well as social camaraderie. And I'll add, it should be everything our clergy should want to see in the faith. especially in these times where renewal is so sorely needed. It has high attendance, long lineups for confession, enthusiastic participation in extracurricular activities like social events and baptisms and other sacraments, an average age that probably sits around 12 years old, more altar servers than we have room for in the sanctuary, and more recently, probably the highest output of vocations for the diocesan seminary from a single church community. Now, if that liturgy was shut down, we aren't just talking about a liturgy. We're talking about an entire community of people who love each other, who depend on each other, who support each other, and who pray with and for one another. And they come from all over the city to do so. We would all be scattered to various parishes where we aren't well integrated, where we don't fit in as well, and where we don't know everyone. To unhesitatingly implement a policy to do such a thing without any pressing need strikes me as unbelievably callous. And the worst part is, every time this hits the headlines, it's at the insistence of some bishop who gives relentless lip service to the dialect of synodality and pastoral accompaniment, which makes it really hard for onlookers like myself to believe that by those things they mean anything more than listening to the selective voices that happen to fit their very narrow definition of Catholicism. Not to mention all this talk about going out to the margins. What do the margins mean if it doesn't describe caring for vulnerable minorities, which is a perfect description of TLM Catholics? When my family went to the Latin Mass for the first time, it wasn't because we had an attachment to that liturgy. In fact, we knew next to nothing about it. Our first time, everything felt weird and foreign to us, and it took a long time before anything like an attachment to it began to develop. If anything, I would say that we had a previous attachment to the Novus Ordo. For us, this wasn't about liturgy. It was about finding a place where we could be confident that the unaltered Catholic faith would be offered to us. Because at other parishes we had belonged to, I don't think that could be claimed. There were serious liturgical abuses taking place, and often the best thing you could say about the teaching efforts was that it wasn't explicitly heretical. And we watched as other families came and went, and their kids grew up in these parishes and suddenly disappeared in their late teens, one after another. And I remember thinking, obviously we're going to do everything we can as parents to help our kids remain in the faith, but what we see happening at typical parishes is a catastrophic attrition rate that I wasn't willing to risk my kids' future on. And for my part, I don't blame a lot of the young people who do fall away. This for me highlights why liturgy is actually so important and so much more than personal preferences like preferences of music. Liturgy, at least where I live, is dominated by the sensibilities of the 1960s and the 1970s, which may have been exciting for that time of change and disruption, but once the novelty of what they were doing wore off, when compared to what had existed for centuries prior, it looks kind of pathetic. And it has nothing that resonates with younger Catholics. But this is the only kind of presentation of Catholicism that we are offering to them. Hymns that were unique to that era, architecture from that era, even the liturgy itself was rewritten according to the sensibilities of what was going on in that moment of history, which is now largely irrelevant. And don't mistake what I'm saying there. I'm not saying that the liturgy, that the Novus Ordo is irrelevant, but just the sensibilities that inspired much of the reforms and then eventually its implementation. Because here's the thing, liturgy is a form of culture. Actually, I'd say it's the highest form of culture. And culture has the ability to stir up our affection and strengthen the bonds that we have within our communities. But it also has the ability to repel people away if they find nothing in it but superficiality and banality. And the way the liturgy has been implemented for the past 60 years dramatically fits that description. Liturgy, as it's commonly practiced today, especially in places like Canada where I live, can fairly universally be described as painfully cringe. How can we possibly expect young people or outsiders to look at that with an admiration or even sympathy? Which is why liturgy as the highest form of culture is intrinsic to the church's vitality and its mission. So it's no wonder the church's attrition rate is so painfully high today. We're repelling people away with bad culture instead of attracting them with the richness of our tradition. And the teachings, they've always been the same, so we can't really blame that for this attrition because that only started taking shape since we started experimenting with culture. It's a very modern 20th and 21st century phenomenon to have this mass exodus of population. That's an experiment that I knew I could survive when I joined the church, in spite of so much of what I'm describing being a turnoff to me in my 20s. But now that I have kids who are getting older, it's an experiment I'm unwilling to make with their salvation hanging in the balance. With traditional liturgy and traditional Catholic culture, there is no experiment. It had already been tried and tested for centuries. So when people try to frame these outbursts of controversy as just people like me trying to assert our own preferences, I find that to be condescending and exhausting. I just want to be formed by the authentic Orthodox Catholic faith, and I want my children to be able to find that too. And since there are no Reverend Novus Ordos in our diocese, we turned to the Latin Mass. And I'm not being hyperbolic there. Take even just one ingredient like chant, which Vatican II said was the standard, the highest form by which all other sacred music should be compared to. You can't find chant at a single parish within my archdiocese except for at the cathedral or the Latin Mass. So when we did turn to the Latin Mass hoping to find unaltered Orthodox Catholicism, we discovered as well a richness of community that we never could have imagined. It has only inspired us to grow closer and deeper in love with God and his church. Any bishop who looks at that with hostility and contempt is clearly motivated by something other than the commission that has been given to lead according to the example of a good shepherd who loves Christ's flock. And anyone else who believes that shutting down TLMs only affects a sample of people who are inordinately attached to something that is merely a personal preference, I would invite to try a little bit harder to show both fraternal charity towards their fellow Catholics and to step outside the narrowness of their thinking to see what these communities actually look like. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.